The date, December 6th, 1941. A peaceful weekend in America. But out in the Pacific, a firestorm was gathering. A task force of Japanese aircraft carriers had slipped to within a few hundred miles of the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor. At dawn, they launched their warplanes, hundreds of them, in a stunning and deadly surprise attack. For the United States, a long period of isolationism had come to a swift and tragic end. World War II, already raging in Europe for 2 years, had finally hit home, and a sleeping giant had awakened. The war would demand great feats of courage on the battlefields of Europe, across the vast expanses of the Pacific, and miles overhead, high in the sky. It would also require great feats of industrial might, more manufacturing output than the world had ever seen. Thousands of heavily armed warships to sweep the seas, tens of thousands of tanks to punch through German lines, and hundreds of thousands of warplanes, planes enough to darken the skies. In aircraft factories all across America, farm hands and housewives and clerks, more than 1 million strong, would join forces to build the mightiest air armada ever launched. Lightning-fast fighters to shoot down enemy planes. Deadly bombers to flatten German and Japanese war plants. And tough, reliable cargo planes to airlift troops and supplies into battle. The challenge to America's young aviation industry was formidable.
Between, say, 1919 and 1939, which is generally considered the golden age, the interwar period, at an average of 2,000 to 3,000 aircraft a year, we're looking at 40,000 to 60,000 aircraft total were produced. By 1944, in 1944 alone, the United States produced almost 100,000 airplanes.
The production was incredible, figures that were highly unimaginable years before. By the end of the war, some 300,000 military aircraft had been produced. What this required was an incredible managerial and organizational ability that no other industry had manifested before then.
American warplanes would soon become the stuff of legend. So would the men who created them. Men like Dutch Kindleberger and Lee Atwood, whose Mustang fighter would decimate the German Luftwaffe. Roy Grumman, a soft-spoken engineer whose Hellcat would leap from carrier decks in the Pacific to maul the Japanese Air Force. Donald Douglas, whose DC-3 airliner would become the military's Goonie Bird, the lifeline of Allied troops throughout the world. And Bill Boeing, whose name marked the bombers that would shatter Hitler's war machine. Ironically, just 20 years before, mere survival was the toughest battle most airplane manufacturers were fighting. In the early 1920s, barnstormers captivated the nation's fancy with feats of aerial daring. But while airplane pilots enjoyed fame and fortune, airplane manufacturers struggled to find a market for their wares. Surprisingly, the man who finally set the pattern for success was not an aviator, but a wealthy Northwest timber baron. His name was Bill Boeing.
Bill Boeing was a millionaire many times over, long before he got into the aviation business. He was a financial genius, if you will. He was not a builder in the sense of he was not a designer or an engineer, but he knew the financial world, and he brought in the best people he could find to run his companies, which is why his company was so successful.
Boeing's big opportunity came in 1925 when the U.S. Post Office opened the nation's embryonic airmail routes to private contractors. Boeing put in a low-ball bid on the longest and hardest route, Chicago to San Francisco, and soon surprised competitors by turning a profit. Soon, Boeing started carrying passengers along with the mail, and a pioneering U.S. airline was born. Boeing's air transport subsidiary became United Airlines. In 1933, in the heart of the Great Depression, Bill Boeing unveiled a dazzling new airliner called the 247.
Well, the Boeing 247 is widely considered to be the first modern airliner. Modern in the sense that it was all metal construction, cantilevered wings, in other words, had internal supports, retractable landing gear, cowled engines, controllable pitch propellers, major breakthrough. Its cruising speed was about 160 miles an hour, which was 60% faster than contemporary airliners of the time, the likes of the Ford Tri-Motor and whatnot. The Boeing 247 first flew on February 8, 1933, entered service about a month or so later with United Airlines, and completely revolutionized air transportation in the United States.
Boeing's 247 rendered all other airliners obsolete. Then the Boeing company made a mistake that would haunt it for decades. TWA, one of United's fiercest rivals, ordered 20 of the new airliners. But Boeing refused the order. The first 60 planes were earmarked for United. Saddled with obsolete planes, TWA desperately sought another builder to produce a competitive model. Finally, a designer in Los Angeles took the job. His name was Donald Douglas. Douglas's challenge to the Boeing 247 was a prototype he called the DC-1. But he never sold DC-1s. Instead, he leapfrogged straight to improved production models, the DC-2, and soon an even better model, the DC-3. The DC-3 introduced wing flaps which added lift, allowing the plane to use shorter runways or land at slower, safer speeds. More powerful engines, which gave the plane a top speed of 200 miles an hour, and a 21-passenger cabin, which gave the plane far more earning power than the 10-passenger Boeing design.
Virtually every American airline going into World War II was flying DC-3s. That was the standard American airliner. 21 passengers, it would cruise at higher altitudes, at greater speed, with greater range than any other passenger airliner in the sky. And it had the right economics, the right combination between costs and performance. So it became the standard by which all other commercial airliners were judged.
Even United Airlines, whose monopoly on the Boeing 247 had triggered the Douglas design, replaced its Boeing planes with Douglas airliners. But it was the outbreak of World War II that launched the Douglas plane by the thousands.
We took the small passenger door out on the left side of the airplane and put in a big door. Then we beefed up the floor structure so that we could carry cannon or various artillery pieces, and you could actually run a Jeep up into the cabin of a DC-3. And the door was wide enough to load cargo. And also part of the door would come off so they could drop parachute jumpers out of it.
Dressed in olive drab, the military version of the DC-3 was officially named the C-47. But soldiers fondly called it the Goonie Bird for the ungainliness with which it lumbered into the air with its loads. The Douglas plane came to dominate military transport, just as it had passenger service. But the Boeing company was not about to sit on the sidelines. Boeing began work on a new plane and came roaring back into the heat of battle with a plane that would become a legend. By the late 1930s, Donald Douglas was the nation's foremost aircraft builder. The success of the DC-3 turned his factory into a beehive of activity. With the outbreak of war, the beehive became a hornet's nest. But Douglas's rival, Boeing, was also carried aloft on the winds of war. After the untimely death of its 247 commercial airliner, Boeing's engineers concentrated on designing planes for the military. By 1935, they had unveiled the prototype for a remarkable new bomber, the B-17. The B-17 was big, tough, and armed to the teeth. Besides 2,000 pounds of bombs, the B-17 boasted gun turrets in its nose, tail, back, and belly. An awestruck journalist described the prototype as a flying fortress, and the name stuck. Building the bombers was a veritable army of workers. At one point, 45,000 of them. They were recruited wherever they could be found. Soon, the Douglas and Lockheed factories were building B-17s as well. As more and more men went to war, more and more women came to work. Rosie the Riveter, this group of workers was called, and by 1943, Rosies by the thousands were building B-17s.
A riveter was one of the gals that would drill a hole and shoot a rivet. Now, most women are very, very proud of the fact that they worked during the war, and they like to be called Rosie the Riveter, but some of them have never even touched a rivet or know what a rivet looks like. I am Rosie the Riveter. I drilled that hole and I shot that rivet, and I'm proud of that.
The numbers of women in the workforce are very substantial. Our best estimates are that 4.5 million women that would not have worked for wages before were in the workforce during World War II.
There were very few men. We had about 98% women in that whole plant. They drove the tugs. They delivered the aircraft to female civilian pilots out there, you know. They worked in the machine shop. I was amazed. But when you're at war and you're fighting for your country, there's nothing you can't do or won't try to do to help win the war.
The pace was frantic, the hours were long, and the work was often exhausting. But the sense of urgency made fatigue seem unimportant.
A B-17 line moved every 7.5 hours. We built over 3,000 B-17s. That's a lot of ships. I'd come home at night, and man, I was ready to hit the sack. Sure, we were tired, but we knew we had a job to do. And, you know, we weren't sure we were going to win that war. And if we could contribute to it, it was the best thing in the world could have happened to us.
Many Rosies were housewives whose husbands were at war. A few, though, came from a more colorful background. Near a military base in Alaska, the Army, it seems, shut down several brothels. To make ends meet, the women moved to Seattle and got jobs at Boeing. But soon they found a way to supplement their paychecks by moonlighting in the air raid shelters beneath the factory. Morale rose to an all-time high until the women were found out and fired. Despite such occasional distractions, the makeshift workforce made good. By 1943, Boeing was churning out 16 forts a day, one every 40 minutes. In Europe, the Army's 8th Air Force put the Flying Fortress to deadly use. In August of 1943, 376 B-17s left England for a strike on German ball-bearing and aircraft factories. It marked the beginning of a campaign of round-the-clock bombing. The Boeing B-17 was at the heart of crippling Allied airstrikes, including massive raids that launched 1,000 bombers at a time.
Over Berlin, the Germans came in at us head on. There were some mid-air collisions, and there were pieces of airplane and pieces of people that were in the air up there. It was a pretty horrendous thing. I mean, I'm sure you've seen many pictures and accounts of planes that come back that look like they were just absolutely unflyable. That plane would fly as long as the crew was willing to stay with it.
The B-17s inflicted a fearsome toll, not just on the ground, but in the air as well. B-17 gunners shot down 2/3 of all enemy fighters destroyed during the war. All told, Boeing built 7,000 B-17s. Two other companies, Douglas and Lockheed, built 5,000 more. But it wasn't enough. As the war escalated, it quickly became clear that mass production on an unimaginable scale was needed. And so the Pentagon looked to the man whose very name was synonymous with assembly line production, Henry Ford. On nearly 2,000 acres of Michigan farmland west of Detroit by a small stream called Willow Run, Henry Ford's bulldozers and dump trucks began laying the groundwork for the world's longest assembly line. It would be a mile-long marvel designed to build bombers automotive style. The man who made it happen was Ford's production chief, Charles Sorensen.
Charles Sorensen was actually appalled by the methods he saw being used to build aircraft. It was basically 35 years out of date by automotive standards. And when asked if he had an idea how to do it, he said, "I'll have something for you in the morning."
He just took the backside of a calendar pad and sketched out a drawing of what he had in mind for his factory. It was a straight line factory. Put the materials in one side and fly the airplanes out the other.
They told him it wasn't possible. But you don't know Charlie. It was just like waving a red flag in front of a bull. He had to do it.
The factory measured 3.5 million square feet, more than 80 acres. Adjoining it, Ford built an immense airport with miles of runway. But the planes intended for those runways were slow in coming. A year and a half after groundbreaking, the gigantic plant had yielded barely a handful of bombers.
The public was not very patient, and our troops were dying, and we needed the aircraft, and they weren't coming yet. So there was a lot of emotion built up over Willow Run. A popular headline was the phrase, "Will it run?" This was a tremendous investment. It was a multi-million-dollar investment on the part of the country in this facility, and nothing was coming out of it. And the Ford Motor Company didn't have ready answers. People thought that once you had a building, you merely flipped a switch and finished bombers flew off into the heavens. It didn't work that way.
But finally, in 1943, the Willow Run plant hit its stride. The complex assembly line was like a huge freight train. Although ponderous to set in motion, it gradually acquired astonishing momentum. 31 bombers in January, 75 in February, 104 in March, 148 in April. The mile-long assembly line was gathering steam. Day and night, an army of workers, including many Rosies, built the bombers. A few workers had rather unique qualifications.
When the planes start going down the assembly line, they call center wing, that would be the center. But the very tip, a normal-sized person could not rivet there. They couldn't get inside. See, they hired midgets or little people to go get inside to buck the rivets. because anyone else couldn't do it.
All in all, it's something you couldn't believe. You look around at all those people there. Some of them couldn't read or write. Some couldn't even speak English. But they all put forth the effort you wouldn't believe, and there was no discord among any of them.
By the end of 1943, with 46,000 workers on the assembly line and another 22,000 making parts off-site, Willow Run was spitting out 12 new bombers a day. The new plane was called the B-24 Liberator.
It was faster than the B-17, and it could fly farther. It had the range on it, the B-24 was about 3,000 miles, whereas the B-17 is around 2,000 miles. But the bomb loads were practically the same. But I found it had a few drawbacks because the fuel lines seemed to run through the bomb bay, and if those little connections weren't made exactly so, why, that airplane could go kabooms, which some of them did, you know.
It was not a popular airplane. It was not easy to fly. It was a hard airplane, and you had to wrestle. At the end of an 8-hour mission, you got out and your legs feel like somebody had just jabbed big burning needles up into them because of that constant work. But it kept bringing us back.
And gradually, whatever shortcomings it may have possessed, the Liberator more than made up for in sheer numbers and range. All told, American factories built more than 18,000 B-24s, more than any other airplane produced during the war. Ford alone assembled 6,800 and shipped another 1,900 in pieces to other factories for assembly. Henry Ford and his assembly line had joined up and earned their stripes. By the latter half of 1943, wave upon wave of American-built bombers were striking deep into the heart of Nazi territory. But the deeper the bombers penetrated, the more vulnerable they became to Luftwaffe fighters. The Liberators and fortresses needed protection. Soon, there emerged a revolutionary new fighter plane to provide it. To defeat Adolf Hitler, it was essential that the Allies cripple the factories of the Nazi war machine. Britain's Royal Air Force mounted massive nighttime bombing attacks. America's 8th Air Force staged daring daylight raids. The raids took a deadly toll on both sides. As Allied bombers struck deeper and deeper into the heart of Germany, going far beyond the range of their escort fighters, German interceptors brought down a heartbreaking number of planes. One out of every 3 B-17s was lost or damaged beyond repair. The Allies needed a faster, deadlier escort, one that could go the distance with the bombers and outfight Germany's best fighters. The need would be met by a company that had never even built a fighter plane, North American Aviation. In the spring of 1940, North American got an urgent request from Great Britain. Desperate for fighters, Britain asked for bids on 100 P-40s, airplanes designed nearly 5 years earlier. Dutch Kindleberger, North American's president, feared that the outdated P-40 couldn't hold its own against faster German aircraft.
I talked to Dutch about the possibility of designing an airplane of our own, a fighter, and I knew that we couldn't get a contract from the Air Corps because we hadn't built one.
But Britain was desperate. When North American proposed building a new fighter, the Brits ordered 320 of them sight unseen. North American got the go-ahead in April of 1940, 2 days after Germany invaded Norway. The fighter's official designation was the P-51. Its name, coined by the Brits, was the Mustang. North American had just 100 days to produce the prototype, an unheard-of schedule for a new design. Adding to the pressure were the plane's revolutionary features: a thin, streamlined wing and an innovative radiator whose jet-like exhaust added some 30 miles an hour to the plane's top speed. As the plane took shape, Hitler provided a grim reminder of what was at stake. He launched a fierce airborne assault on Britain, the prelude to an invasion. Day and night, the Germans pounded away. Their backs to the wall, the outnumbered and outgunned pilots of the Royal Air Force, the thin blue line they were called, beat back wave after wave of German attackers. But the battle had stretched the thin blue line perilously close to breaking. The Mustang was needed more than ever. At North American, work continued at a fever pitch. But suddenly, a disastrous problem loomed, not with the Mustang's exotic design, but with North American's own workers, a wildcat strike by the local union demanding higher pay.
This is a very controversial strike because there's some evidence that the local union did have leaders that were either belonged to the Communist Party or at least were influenced by communist ideology. And so therefore it became a real lightning rod for the debate over communism at the time. As the strike went on, eventually Roosevelt brought in the army to break the strike. And again, this was quite shocking to the labor movement.
The president's strong stance worked, and soon Mustang fighters took to the skies at speeds approaching 400 miles an hour. But the Mustang was just getting warmed up. In 1942, the Mustang's General Motors engine was replaced by a powerful Rolls-Royce engine called the Merlin.
I'll never forget when the flight test came in for speed. They had level flight speed at 25,000 feet, 443 miles an hour.
It could outfly any plane in Hitler's Air Force. The Mustang's performance swiftly earned it the reputation as the best fighter in Europe. And with auxiliary fuel tanks, its range stretched to more than 2,000 miles, enough to reach the most distant targets in Germany.
P-51 was a type of airplane would do almost anything you ask it to, from 35,000 feet down to what we call the deck, down to ground level. We began to fly these missions in P-47s. In June of 1944, we switched over to the P-51C. It was almost like climbing out of a Mack truck into a Rolls-Royce.
North American was swamped with orders and expanded dramatically to meet the demand.
In 3 plants, we peaked out at about 105 or 110,000 people. Big factory at Kansas City, Kansas, and another in Dallas, Texas.
By the 4th Mustang model, the P-51D, with its distinctive bubble canopy, demand had skyrocketed. Nearly 8,000 of them galloped off the assembly lines. The Luftwaffe could not withstand the stampede. Mustangs soon ruled the sky, shooting down nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft and destroying another 5,000 on the ground.
We started out by doing bomber escort. We did dive bombing. The Mustang, of course, was a tremendous dive bombing airplane, not only to mention its speed, but it had the capability to carry 2 1,000-pound bombs, which in those days was a pretty good bomb load. Without a doubt, the Mustang was the best prop-driven aircraft of World War II.
The Mustang became the dominant fighter in the skies over Europe. But half a world away, in the skies above the Pacific, that distinction belonged to a fighter plane from a place called the Iron Works. In the bloody battle for the Pacific, the U.S. finally evened the score with Japan at the Battle of Midway, fought in June of 1942. There, Navy pilots sank 3 Japanese carriers and crippled a 4th, and Japan lost nearly 300 planes. It was a sign of things to come. The war in the Pacific marked the combat debut of the aircraft carrier for both Japan and the United States, and it was a most convincing debut. Carrier-based airplanes swept the skies for hundreds of miles around their ships, and the major naval battles of the Pacific were won or lost by air power. A pivotal role in those battles was played by planes from a Long Island factory known as the Iron Works, Grumman Aircraft. It was the creation of a soft-spoken engineer named Roy Grumman.
My father was the conceptual engineering type who had the ideas and had a genius for the mechanics of flight and what it took to make an airplane perform the way it should.
A former Navy test pilot, Grumman had a superb grasp of the unique demands imposed by aircraft carriers. His first Navy fighter was a 2-seater, but it could outfly the Navy's fastest single-seat fighter. The Navy ordered 27 of them. Grumman expanded from a tiny garage into a real factory on Long Island. By 1940, Grumman was on his 4th major fighter design for the Navy. Officially designated the F-4F fighter, it was called the Wildcat. It owed its most innovative feature to a rubber eraser and a pair of paper clips. A space-saving folding wing, which doubled the number of planes a carrier could hold.
So my father had been thinking about this, he said, for some time without success. To help him visualize this, he actually took 2 paper clips and an eraser, and by sticking this into an eraser at different angles, he was able to get the wing to fold neatly along the side of the plane. And he made this model where the wings folded, and he put it in a box, and he trundled off to Washington carrying this box. And he sat down with the Bureau of Aeronautics people, and he opened the box. He took out the plane with the wings folded, put it on the table, and then spread the wings out to their position. And in his words, the Bureau of Aeronautics people were delighted and amazed.
After Pearl Harbor, with the Navy fighting a 2-ocean war, U.S. shipyards were building new aircraft carriers by the dozens. Demand for Wildcats proved almost insatiable. Grumman's manufacturing complex grew from 1 plant to 2, then 3, sprawling over 120 acres. Production lines ran 20 hours a day. During the long, bloody battle for Guadalcanal, even top speed wasn't fast enough.
Grumman Aircraft Company was going full bore on a production line producing these Wildcats. And it so happened that they had a bunch of parts for Wildcats all crated up and ready to send out to the carriers for use as replacement parts. And then when the Navy put in a call to the company desperately asking for more of these planes as quickly as possible, the company actually came in on a weekend and opened the crates and put together 24 Wildcats, which were immediately shipped out to the fleet.
The Wildcat was a scrappy fighter. One day, a lone Wildcat pilot named Butch O'Hare gave a powerful demonstration of what the airplane could do.
Butch O'Hare was a young Lieutenant J.G. who had been in the Combat Air Patrol over the Lexington during the Battle of Coral Sea, and he was the only airplane airborne when a group of Japanese airplanes came in, and bombers, and he single-handedly shot down 6 of them right over the carrier inside of everybody. They all saw it happen. For that, he received the Medal of Honor.
But against Japanese fighter planes, the Wildcat had a tougher time. The Japanese Zero had surprised the Americans with its speed and maneuverability. The Zero wasn't as tough as the Wildcat, but in dogfight after dogfight, the Japanese fighter proved faster and more nimble.
The standard tactic in those days, they had some very experienced Japanese pilots, and their standard evasion tactic, if you jumped one of them, was they immediately went into a loop. And if you followed them through the loop in a Wildcat, on the second loop, they would be behind you.
The Ironworks got busy on a new and better fighter. On August 31st, 1943, in the skies above Marcus Island, that new fighter made its combat debut, the Grumman Hellcat. Roy Grumman soon learned that the Japanese Zero finally met its match.
Yes, I remember receiving a wire after the Hellcat squadrons were fighting from one of the squadron commanders saying that the ratio was 200 to 1. In other words, 200 Jap planes shot down for the loss of one Hellcat.
In battle after battle, the Hellcat earned its name. The Navy clamored for more, and Grumman responded with more production lines. Grumman's workforce soon topped 25,000, and a third of the workers were women. Some built Hellcats, others test flew the powerful planes. To keep women on the job, Grumman opened daycare centers. To keep wounded soldiers alive, the company held regular blood drives. To keep morale high, there were musical concerts at lunchtime. To keep employees fit, the company organized daily calisthenics and intramural softball. The strategy worked. Absenteeism and resignations dropped. Productivity soared. The 12,000 Hellcats built by Grumman mauled the Japanese Air Force mercilessly. U.S. carrier planes destroyed nearly 6,500 Japanese aircraft. 80% of those were downed by Hellcats. Even if they didn't win every dogfight, Hellcats almost always survived them. Sometimes they made it home against staggering odds.
There was a tremendous explosion, and I looked out to the left and almost fainted because about 80% of the wing was gone. I noticed in the mirror that my port, elevator, and stabilizer were completely gone off the airplane on the left side. Make a long story short, I was able to fly that airplane back out over the fleet. About that time, they had an airplane come up and join me, and he looked at me and he said, "Did you know your left wheel is gone?" I said, "No." He said, "But your hook is down." He said, I made a nice, gentle carrier landing and went in, caught a wire, and even with no wheel on the left, it just stopped on the deck. We flew that airplane 10 days later.
Finally, in August of 1945, it ended. Another new American plane, a solitary Boeing B-29 Super Fortress, took off from a Pacific air base, flew high over Hiroshima, Japan, and dropped a bomb that would end the war and change the world forever. History, it's been said, has a way of repeating itself. The end of World War II, like the end of the First World War, meant the wholesale cancellation of military contracts. Companies that had flourished on wartime contracts suddenly found themselves struggling once more. Factories that had frantically expanded and staffed up to meet the urgent demands of war suddenly found themselves empty and idle. Boeing laid off 43,000 workers. Other manufacturers followed suit. G.I. Joe came home a hero. Rosie the Riveter lost her job.
During the war, they were so glad to have us. They used to come in during the war, and they'd come in and they'd thank us. You know, the guys are flying in and come and tell us what a good job we're doing and everything else. But after the war, they wanted us to go home, take care of the babies, and just stay away from the jobs.
But the end of the Second World War was soon followed by the start of the Cold War. The Cold War brought jet fighters and super-secret spy planes. The Cold War also launched the space race and a whole new frontier of research, development, and government contracts opened up. Space projects became too big for single companies. Instead, pieces were parceled out among scores of subcontractors. Aviation became aerospace, a huge, expensive, and complex business, one increasingly driven by mergers and acquisitions. The space age brought remarkable advances in the capabilities of warplanes, blazing speed, powerful new weapons, and near invisibility to radar thanks to the advent of stealth technology. Over its lifetime, America's aviation industry has undergone dramatic changes. The early pioneers of aircraft design and construction would scarcely recognize the industry they started. In the course of a century, it's grown from a crackpot gamble into one of the world's most powerful industries. At the dawn of the 20th century, the sky literally was the limit. Today, at the threshold of the 21st century, that limit has been left far behind.